Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's U to U lecture series for the 2021 season, proudly hosted by the U alumni. My name is Nubia Pena, and I'm Senior Advisor of Equity and Opportunity to Governor Cox and the Director of the Utah Division of Multicultural Affairs. I am also a proud member of the Board of Governors for U alumni. My preferred pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I have the great pleasure of moderating today's event focused on preventing relationship and sexual violence on campus. Now, as a gentle reminder, please feel free to use the live chat to submit your questions, and we will field them after the formal presentation. Now, during today's experience, we have the great opportunity to hear from Dr. Chris Linder, an Associate Professor of Higher Education and Director of the U's McCluskey Center for Violence Prevention. Her scholarship focuses on sexual violence and student activism using critical and power and identity conscious frameworks. Prior to becoming faculty, she worked as the student affairs educator and administrator for 10 years, spending the majority of her career as a director of a campus-based women's center supporting survivors of sexual violence. Dr. Linder's book, Sexual Violence on Campus, Power-Conscious Approaches to Awareness, Prevention, and Response, has received praise from educators for being accessibly and practically written. Additionally, in partnership with Dr. Jessica C. Harris of UCLA, Dr. Linder co-edited Intersections of Identity and Sexual Violence on Campus. Dr. Linder, thank you so very much for your time, your expertise, and more than anything, your service to our U of U community. We do look forward to learning from you and engaging you in discussion at the conclusion of your remarks. And I know that your team is also with you. And so we look forward to hearing from you and them as well. And so with that, the time is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to participate today. We are very excited to be here. I'm so proud to have with me today 3 of our student staff members from the McCluskey Center for Violence Prevention. So I'm going to ask the 3 of them to introduce themselves now, and we'll go in alphabetical order by last name. So Taylor, MaryJo, and then Blessing.
Hi, my name is Taylor Basiso. I am a student here at the U, majoring in genetics. I am a student staff at the McCluskey Center for Violence Prevention, and I am very happy to be here.
My name is MaryJo. I'm about to graduate, and I am studying social work.
Hi, everyone. I'm Blessing Helis. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm undergrad staff at the MCVP, and I'm majoring in anthropology.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. So we do have a presentation prepared today to start off the conversation. It's sort of a combination of sharing what is the McCluskey Center for Violence Prevention, what is it we're trying to do, tied in with a little bit of education. We work really hard in the center to try and make the connections between the ways that power and oppression show up in our culture and how that relates to relationship and sexual violence. And so that's very much what we're going to be talking about today. We will, of course, have time at the end for questions and discussion. So I'm going to share our presentation and we will get started. So we've done our introductions. I'm going to turn it over to Blessing.
All right, everyone. So just before we dive into this presentation, I wanted to give a quick land labor acknowledgement. So it is important to note that our work takes place on land that European colonizers stole from Indigenous people through violence, including sexual violence. Specifically, the Bannock, Goshute, Navajo, Paiute, Shoshone, and Ute peoples lived in the land that is now considered Utah. Further, enslaved people likely provided exploited labor on which the University of Utah was built. Acknowledging the land and labor exploitation is vital to engaging in social justice and equity work. As we move forward in our collective work, I implore you to remember our responsibility to those who are here before us, to honor their legacies and call attention and interrupt exploitation as often as possible through our work. And to further begin our talk about the center, we need to address the naming of the center. So Lauren McCluskey was a U of U senior communication major and member of the track and field team who was senselessly and tragically murdered in October 2018 by someone she briefly dated. We strive to honor Lauren's life and legacy through our work. We also recognize the countless additional survivors and victims of relationship and sexual violence whose stories we do not know, especially those who are silenced by oppression. So I want to talk a little bit about the history that inspired the development of the MCVP. So the first documented study in examining campus sexual violence was conducted in 1957. And while it is important to keep in mind that this study largely focused on cisgender women, it is also important to note that 1 in 5 women in 1957 had experienced sexual harassment and or assault in their lifetime, which is about the same rate that persists today.
So when we're talking about sexual violence, it's important to understand that it is wound with all forms of oppression. When we're looking at who perpetrators are targeting, it is specifically bisexual women, gay men, trans people, Indigenous women, and people with disabilities. And the reason we see that is because sexual violence is not about pleasure, it's about power. And that's why we see people with more minoritized identities being victimized in comparison to their unminoritized peers.
So we also, as I said in the beginning, part of our mission at the center is to make sure that we're acknowledging the long history related to this topic. So unfortunately, when we start talking about relationship and sexual violence, especially on college campuses, we often talk about it as though it started in the 1970s, which is around the heyday of the white feminist movement that really drew attention to this issue on college campuses. And while that part is extremely important, it's also important to note that this isn't something that started happening in the 1970s. This is something that, as Blessing and Taylor both talked about in previous slides, is tied to a long, long history in the United States. So it's important to note that rape was actually used as a tool of terrorization and economic control during the colonization of what is now known as the United States and of slavery. So I think it's important to know, I think some people don't know this, and so it's just important to name explicitly that during the times of slavery in what is now called the United States, the property of, the children of enslaved people became the property of the slave owners, and therefore there was a lot of incentive for people who were owning slaves during this period to expand their labor supply and their property, so to speak, by ensuring that the people that they owned had more and more children. And so this led to a unique form of rape and sexual violence. And so our country is literally built on issues related to relationship, or more specifically to sexual violence and rape. It's also interesting to note that sexual violence actually started out as a property crime in the US. So as I just talked about, enslaved women were considered very much property. Similarly, women across the United States during this time period were also considered the property of their husbands or fathers. And so when we first started to have laws related to sexual violence in our country, they were property crimes. They were a violation of the property of the men. And so women couldn't even file charges of sexual violence. Their fathers or their husbands who owned them were the ones who could file charges of sexual violence during the early beginnings of US law. Another piece of our history that's difficult to talk about, yet so important to this movement, is the period of lynching that was happening in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, when Black and African American people were considered free. There was a lot of violence directed towards Black men specifically, and it was very much tied to white women's purity and sanctity. And so even though we know that most Black men were not raping white women, there is a long history in our country of this perception that Black men, Latino men, men of color, poor men have higher rates of violence. And that's tied, again, back to that history. And it's simply not true, even though it's a stereotype that lives on today. The other thing to note that's related to this is that the civil rights era, which we often think of as a movement that Black people engaged in to get more civil rights, voting, access to lots of different resources, education, all of those sorts of things, people very much tie this to Black men's leadership. That's what we learn in our classes. When we do learn about Rosa Parks as a child, we learn about Rosa Parks as being the woman who wouldn't give up her seat on the bus. And interestingly enough, when we dig into that history even more, what we know is that the civil rights era was largely led by Black women, because they were the ones that were riding those buses. They were the ones riding the buses to get to cleaning white people's houses and all of the other work that they were doing. And so when we make that history invisible, we again take away the sexualized, racist behaviors that were happening during this time period, and we make those Black women's organizing and activism invisible. Similarly, as we move into the tough on crime era in the 1990s, this is also very much tied to our work. So the Violence Against Women Act was originally passed in 1994. We, as people doing work around relationship and sexual violence, really often praise the Violence Against Women Act. It's something that's seen as a huge historic landmark, something really good that happened in our work. And it's important for us to complicate that notion, right? So the reason that VAWA passed is because white women had access to the white men in Congress and pushed this to get passed. And what ends up happening is we have yet again over-relied on policy and criminalization to address an issue that is tightly wound with oppression, discrimination, and all kinds of other cultural issues that can't necessarily be addressed just by policy. And when we over-rely on policy, what ends up happening is we contribute to this over-criminalization of people of color, of poor people, of people who are already overrepresented in the criminal justice system. And at the same time, we don't actually reduce rates of violence. So as rates of incarceration have increased, rates of violence have not decreased. So it's important for us to just know all of this history is very much tied. It sounds very distant from college students on college campuses in 2021, but the reality is this is so tightly wound with our work that when we know this history, we can see it playing out in lots of different ways, even with college students. The other thing that we know about addressing relationship and sexual violence on college campuses is that most of the research and the educational programs that have existed across the country for decades focus on victimization risk factors. So we did a content analysis study and we looked at all of the research that's been done on this topic. And we found that more than 60% of the articles focused on victimization risk factors and fewer than 10% focused on perpetration risk factors. So most of our educational programs in turn focus on teaching people how not to be victims as opposed to focusing on the intersections of oppression and violence and interrupting perpetration specifically. So that leads us to also in higher education across the country, we primarily focus on relationship and sexual violence by thinking about response, prevention, and awareness around this issue. And what ends up happening is college campuses across the country, again, this is not just the University of Utah, this is a national problem. I always tell my friends who have children going to college, send your kids to a college that have high reported numbers of sexual violence because those are the campuses where they're actually doing work around it. If a campus says they don't have any reports, that means they have their head in the sand and they're not actually in touch with the students and the students don't feel comfortable going forward. So what ends up happening is campuses spend all of this time and energy on responding after it happens, primarily because that's how the laws are set up. The laws we only get in trouble for doing a bad job responding, not for the fact that it's happening in the first place. And so that's where we are at the Center for Violence Prevention, is that we want to add to U's work. So the U is doing some excellent, has improved dramatically their work around response. So better training police officers, working with having the chief safety officer on campus. We've always had excellent victim advocacy on campus. Our tight relationships with the Rape Recovery Center in the community, our tight relationships with UCASA, all of those are pieces put in place to help support students who have experienced violence. So we want to add to that good response by trying to prevent it from happening in the first place.
So moving on to our actual mission statement for the McCluskey Center for Violence Prevention, we say that here at the McCluskey Center for Violence Prevention at the University of Utah, we will serve as a national leader in effort to eliminate relationship and sexual violence among U.S. college students. Using a power-conscious and intersectional framework, the center seeks to bridge the gap between research and practice by bringing together the expertise of researchers, prevention educators, and students alike to execute a comprehensive research agenda focused on the prevention of relationship and sexual violence, and to disseminate knowledge across the US. The work for the center will intentionally focus on students from historically minoritized backgrounds, including students of color, queer and trans students, and students with disabilities. And just to break down some of those more technical terms, when we're talking about power consciousness, it is the idea that you will always hold a certain amount of power in a conversation. The way I like to explain it to my friends is that white guilt is nothing. Like white guilt doesn't actually do anything. Understanding the power that you hold and using it to support others is kind of what we're about. And that's that power consciousness, is being aware of the power that you hold. The next is intersectional framework. And what we mean by that is that we all hold multiple identities. Just because I'm a white woman means that I hold a certain amount of power in that aspect, but at the same time, I am a queer person with a mental disability. And so I have, I'm minoritized in that aspect. And so it's important to understand that there are multiple identities that go into making a person, and multiple identities that may be at play when situations like sexual violence happen.
So what we really focus on here at the center is primary prevention. And as Chris talked about earlier, a typical response that we see across all colleges in the US is that most responses are about responding to the fact after violence has happened. So what we do here is we prevent violence from happening in the first place. That's what we focus on. And we do that by focusing on perpetration and peer culture. And we focus on what happens before violence happens, the conversations people have, the beliefs and stereotypes they hold, cultural and societal beliefs about gender and gender roles, and addressing those limiting and harmful and just misconceptions about all of these things that contribute into what rape culture is and why violence is happening in the first place.
So one of the ways we're working on education is interrupting common master narratives about sexual violence. So we're going to go through a couple of them now. To begin, one of the most frequent myths we hear about sexual violence is that perpetrators are strangers. I think we often have this preconceived notion that perpetrators are the ones in the shadows, hiding in bushes, waiting to attack an unsuspecting victim. And this undoubtedly does happen to a lot of people, but it's one of the less common ways that sexual assault transpires. So when we look at the statistics, over 80% of rape cases involve someone the victim knows. This can be anyone ranging from a friend, an acquaintance, former partner, family member, to name a few. And this fact can be scary to some people, and that's not really the purpose of sharing this statistic. I simply want the audience to be cognizant that harassment can happen even among people we trust. So it's crucial to have a strong sense of sexual agency. Another common RSV myth is that reporting is the number one way to fix rates of violence. And this is a myth because when we talk to victim survivors, this simply isn't the case. Chris shared something with the MCVP staff that I found particularly poignant, and that was during her time as the director of a women's center. She heard over and over again from victim survivors, "I don't want them to get in trouble. I just want them to stop." So oftentimes resolving sexual assault cases through punitive measures is not always what the victim wants, as it can be painful and re-traumatizing. Clearly, there's a desire and need for ways of remediation outside of a penal system.
The last myth we want to leave with you is that once people hit college age, it's too late. And though, yes, we would love to be intervening sooner and sooner, but unfortunately, we don't have the power to reach into the K through 9 or K through 12 education system. We can start now. And when we do actually look at the statistics, we see that, if you don't mind going forward one, Chris, sorry. When we do look at the statistics, we see that 88% of college-age men who have acted on sexual aggression started these behaviors after starting college. So we're still reaching them at the beginning of their problematic behaviors. And I like just saying, despite how the saying goes, it's never too late to teach an old dog new tricks, especially if the trick is respect.
So what we're focusing on at the center is moving away from training and focusing on education. Typically, and we see this across all colleges in the US, is that training consists of bystander training, and that's usually a one-time checkbox rather than a really engaging and educational process. And so education is about it's continual, it's a process, it's engaging, and it's not just about checking the box. And so bystander training, it does not really address perpetrators, but rather calls on others to stop violence than preventing violence from happening in the first place. And so once again, education is just really hitting home that primary prevention part about breaking down all these myths and that we all believe, and making it a community process rather than just an individual doing the bystander training. And so some of the examples of what we're doing here at the Center for Education is the Affinity Groups and the Faculty Staff Series. So the Affinity Groups is a program that focuses on rape and sexual violence taught by graduate students to other students. It's a semester-long experience and is built on specific shared identities that are often marginalized in education and in conversations about RSV. The Faculty Staff Series engages participants to end their educational series with a concrete action plan. Education necessitates action. One must engage with and learn about these issues of primary prevention and then take action.
So another key part of our mission statement that I mentioned earlier is the idea of integrating theory and practice. And what I mean by that is that a lot of times when it comes to violence prevention, there's research teams, there is the people who go out and talk to people, and then there is the people it affects. And we are going to try and smush all these groups together, get the conversation rolling, because each group has unique perspectives that we need in order to get ahead of violence, because, you know, there are some things researchers will not be able to see that a student who is affected by this is, and we need to have that conversation. And a few ways that we're going to be doing that is our working groups. And so right now we have 5, and it is an open call. So if anybody finds this interesting, please head to our website. But the first one is Patterns of Perpetration Research Team. So this is just understanding that, well, when I first got hired, Chris mentioned a statistic that was really astonishing to me, in that only 10% of all of the research ever done on sexual violence even mentions who the perpetrator of that violence is. And so it's almost like we're seeing victim blaming in the research itself. And so this team is put together to focus more on the perpetrator so that we can start with prevention. The next is perpetrator intervention. This is going to be a educational series and kind of like an affinity group almost for people who either believe they may have caused harm or know they have caused harm and are looking to change their behaviors. And so it's a safe place for people to go to learn about what they've done and how it affects others. And what's really important about this one is that it is completely separate from the healing spaces of survivors. A lot of times, almost the prevention is kind of grouped in with the response. And so the same facility will be talking to somebody who has committed a sexual crime right in an office right next to somebody who is a victim of a sexual crime. And we want to make sure that those spaces are separate, so both spaces are safe and healing. The next is going to be the Affinity Identity Group. And we talked, I think MaryJo talked about it a little bit. It's the idea that we're going to be making safe spaces for minoritized groups and identities to share their unique perspectives on sexual violence, because the reality is that right now, but the majority of the work is not focused on these minoritized groups. So we want to make sure that they feel seen and heard. Next is going to be education. This will be those education series that MaryJo was mentioning, where we're going to be making hopefully like a couple or like a series of workshops that go through hopefully more than one each month, but things get busy and we're really, really excited to get that started. And the last one is going to be engaging men, because unfortunately, just statistically, a lot of perpetrators of sexual assault are men. And there are a lot of societal teachings that go into almost building a perpetrator of violence. And so engaging men is going to be a safe space to break down the key societal teachings that almost support sexual violence. Lastly, we just want to say, please contact us. We are so happy whenever we hear out from somebody or see a new follower. So if you are on social media, please follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Our website is listed here. And if you have any questions or comments, please email us at cvp@utah.edu.
Okay, I think we're ready for discussion.
Excellent. Thank you so very much, Dr. Linder, and to your team, MaryJo, Blessing, and Taylor. Wonderful presentation. I just want to thank you for your willingness to join us and to present on such a critical topic. In particular, though, I really want to just acknowledge how brilliantly you all linked sexual violence to oppression and acknowledge that sexual violence uniquely affects historically underserved communities. So again, phenomenal job. So we do have several questions that we're going to prioritize during this next half hour, and we invite all of our audience to please join us and put the questions that you might have regarding this presentation in the chat feature. And so, Dr. Linder, some of the questions that have come through already is you all mentioned that this is a targeted approach to people who have the potential to cause harm. What has been the reception so far? Like, how do people self-identify or potentially break the barrier of feeling shame because they in fact may have harmed someone, either someone they loved or maybe they didn't understand? How do they bridge that, and how do you help them?
Yeah, thank you for framing it that way. So I think this is an area that we are challenged with. So one thing is that we just started this year. We got approval from the Board of Trustees in August. So we have been doing everything through Zoom so far. And so we acknowledge that right now our primary support comes from faculty and staff. Faculty and staff know a lot about what we're doing. They're highly engaged. We have over 100 faculty and staff members engaged in our working groups. We have not had as much success with engaging students. We believe that we are primed to do that coming fall when we get to be back together. The student staff, as you saw, we have 6 student staff in the center, and I think just having people present and being able to go to things will be really helpful. But to get to this notion of like, how do we reach these people who have either caused harm or have the potential to cause harm, and get through the shame, like you said, Nubia, is so important. And a couple of strategies for that. One is to help people understand what harm is. So I think a lot of times people don't understand that ignoring boundaries, all of those things that many of us have just been socialized to believe are part of relationships are actually harmful. And so one of the things that's happening is that we have, when students are engaged and they're reading the materials, they're saying to me, Chris, I didn't know that this is what we were talking about. This has either happened to me, and even I have done some of these things. There have been some really powerful podcasts. There's one in particular from Snap Judgment. It's called Reckonings, and it's about a college student, a man, who during a training, he goes to on campus, he has this aha moment of like, oh my gosh, I think I did that to somebody. And because he had the aha moment on his own, he had the courage to go seek out help and ask people, like, did what I do, was that harmful? And it turns out that he was able to engage in a conversation very appropriately supported. Like they didn't just go off and do it on their own, but he and the person that he caused harm to engaged in a restorative justice process. And at this point, the two of them have an ongoing friendship in which they can engage in conversation about accountability and harm and that sort of thing. So we believe that by introducing that kind of media to campus and sort of making it okay for people to say, you know what, I think I might have done this, and creating spaces where they won't get in trouble, but instead they're able to go through a process of figuring out, what can I do so I don't do this in the future? How can I contribute to my peers not doing this? That sort of thing. That's what we're hoping for and really striving for. So I don't know if anybody else has anything to add to that, but I think that's where we're starting.
Okay, excellent. If no additional comments from the rest of the team, then thank you so much, Dr. Linder. Again, some of the work that is coming out of your center is really innovative in the intersectional approach. You are looking to the holistic view of survivorship, and you're linking this back once again to systemic practices. So Dr. Linder, if you can talk a little bit about how do we get the larger community, the larger campus community, to buy into this idea that it is not just about good touch, bad touch, or healthy relationships, but this is about culture shifts. This is about paradigm shifts. How are you tackling that work?
I'm happy to talk about this. I want to just pause for a minute though and see if anybody else wants to start on this one. I don't want to take up all the airtime.
Happy to. I think that one of the number one ways that we're doing this, and the number one way that we're seeing, or the number one thing that we are seeing the biggest effect in, is sharing those myths of rape culture, because it really is something that we are taught from day one. And one of the technical books that we're reading for like our growth is Sexual Citizens. And in that book, it says, as a child, you are taught from a very young age how to ride a bike, making sure you don't drive out into the street, making sure you don't fall down, wearing your helmet. But none of that effort goes into sexual relationships. None of that. You don't get told from your parents from day one, if somebody makes you uncomfortable, tell them to stop. And so phrasing it in a way that is saying, this is not necessarily your fault, it is the culture's fault, but it is something that each one of us have to do changes in order to shift the narrative and shift culture.
Brilliant, Taylor. Thank you. Any other person would like to share comments or thoughts?
I think another thing is that we have to, I am grateful that finally in the US, we're starting to see some shifts around ways that people are talking about racial justice. And so I think for me, that's another big component of it, is that we need to be part of those conversations, and we actually need to initiate those conversations. And so ways that we think about doing that, one is with the anti-Asian shooting that happened in Atlanta. We wrote a blog post about that. We've engaged with conversation as a staff about that. We've engaged. So all of our working groups are set up to be educational for the people who participate in them, as well as for campus. And so we believe systems are made up of individuals. And so when individuals have culture or have paradigm shifts, that contributes to a larger cultural shift. So we talk about those kinds of things in our working group meetings. Also talking about the relationship between police violence and sexual violence. So we know that sexual misconduct is the second most commonly reported form of police misconduct. And so keeping that conversation front and center when people in fact are starting to pay attention to police violence and the way that specifically Black folks are targeted by police violence, it's important for us to show up and be part of those conversations and not take over those spaces, but participate in those spaces and think about the ways that we can contribute. Because when we all work together and look at how all these forms of oppression are connected to each other, then I think we'll keep feeling this momentum shifting and people having a better understanding of those relationships.
Dr. Linder, thank you so much, because what you're referencing, right, this notion of it's interconnected violence. And so if we're solely trying to target sexual abuse or sexual violence, we fail to consider how that's interconnected to racism and sexism and heterosexism. So Dr. Linder, what is the opportunity that community partners have to collaborate with the center? Because there's a lot of great initiatives that are leading out, but oftentimes their work doesn't take into consideration the implications of sexual assault and rape. How do we make sure that as folks are developing initiatives, how can they make sure that they're centering this part of the lived experience, specifically for people who have existed at the margins?
One of the things that's been the most powerful for me in our working group experience has been the shifts that have happened just from people sharing their stories and their experiences within the group. So another one of our philosophies, and we say this in the community and identity-based intervention description, is that we consider people to be the experts of their own experiences. And so it does not require an expert. We're really trying to interrupt that notion of what an expert on this topic is, because the experts on this topic are the people who have lived it. And so part of what we're learning in the working groups is just by people having real and authentic conversations with each other, that's when these shifts are starting to happen. And so I think about ways that people can keep any issue front and center is to listen to the people who are most impacted. Yes. And invite those people to the table and like genuinely, sincerely listen. What do you think about this? How does this impact you? And when we hear that from the mouths of our colleagues, our friends, people we didn't even know were impacted in such profound ways by this, again, it shifts our way of being, it shifts our paradigm, which then in turn shifts the system, because again, individuals make up systems. We often talk about systemic issues as if they're just this amorphous, the system. Well, yes, and we are that system, right? Like, and if we don't do things to interrupt what's happening, then yes, the system will continue as is. But as individual people, we can start to make some of those shifts. So I think those are some ways.
Thank you, Dr. Linder. And what I value about that response more than anything is that you are once again emboldening and calling out to every single person who is watching and listening and streaming this panel. It is our responsibility. We are the system. We do get to uproot these practices, and we can be part of the solution where we eliminate sexual violence and rape. So thank you, Dr. Linder, for that reminder, which then leads us to the next question. For people who are interested in disrupting violence in our U of U community and beyond, what are some practical things that they can do in their lived experience every day to address and eliminate this form of abuse in our communities? And I'll add something else once you respond. Go ahead.
I know there are a lot of expertise on this one other than me, so I'm gonna not answer this one.
I see Taylor smiling. So Taylor, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so I'm one of the co-chairs for our education working group, and I love doing like homework items for people to take away later. And one of my favorite activities or like growing experiences that I like to put out there is that, unfortunately, just because of how we have evolved and our human monkey brains say that when we don't understand something, then it's dangerous. And so a lot of what has helped me, at least in this work, is taking the time to better understand minoritized identities that I don't come in contact with. Living in Utah, there's not a lot of diversity in especially race and culture. And so it's about taking time out of your day, putting effort towards actively making yourself uncomfortable. because these conversations aren't comfortable. It's not easy going into a space where I know that historically my identity has hurt everybody in this room and or all of the people in this video that I'm watching. And so I really like to say, like, dive into minority group, whether that be watching a documentary like The Burning of Paris or Paris is Burning, or watching a documentary on Black creators. Like, there's so many amazing documentaries that are out there, so many streaming platforms, that it's just, I love the idea of widening your perspective, even if you can't do it with somebody who actually is in your life, doing it through like the gift of the internet. I also like to say, keep a journal, because no matter how long you've been in this work, you will always be unlearning more things. And to better help those around you, because it's also that, you know, we have to be sharing our knowledge, especially with our social spheres, if we want the culture to be moving forward. Keep a journal so you know what impacted you. What was your aha moment today? What was the thing that you heard today that really made you uncomfortable, but made you think about what your practices are? Yeah.
Taylor, I can tell that you have a love of having those moments where you help someone plant that seed and then it blossoms, right? They shifted their perspective or they learned something new. So thank you, Taylor, for that passion. Blessing and MaryJo, anything that you'd like to add to this part of the conversation?
Yeah, I'll add something. So I'm already on board with Taylor's idea of just constantly educating yourself. This was more relevant to the first question you asked, but you were talking about like how perpetrators deal with like shame and things like that. So through my work at the center, I was just reading more and more about like what sexual assault looks like. It's not necessarily what we think it is. Like, I think a lot of people assume that sexual assault is like physical coercion, and physical attacks, things like that. But through my work here at the center, I realized it was more than that. And I had to come to the tough realization that I had done harmful behaviors to my current significant other. And it was really hard for me. But we sat down and had a discussion about it, like how it made him feel, and then how I realized it was wrong. And then we kind of came to a solution together with that. And that was really hard for me, but I'm so glad that I realized that I had done that rather than being blind to it, because I don't want to continue harming him. And even though it like might hurt your ego a little bit to think that, oh, I had done these bad behaviors, it's much better to realize how it was wrong and what you can do better. And then the second thing I would say is to just question power. We kind of touched on this in the presentation, but again, everyone has their own identity that has power over others, or maybe doesn't have power at all. Like one of the interesting statistics I read for this work was not a statistic, it's from Sexual Citizens, but every single Black woman they talked to had experienced sexual assault. Every single one, like there was no exception. And that's just so interesting to me that it really is so tied with power and oppression. So yeah, just questioning your power and how you can help the voices that can't be heard.
Excellent, Blessing. Thank you so very much for the vulnerability and also sharing your own journey of recognizing that we at times are not only victims, we're also perpetrators. And how do we pause to reflect, to grow, and to honor the lived experience of another, so that we're also restoring that relationship. So thank you once again for that. MaryJo, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Taylor and Blessing have said. Education, continual education, whether it's directly about RSV or another aspect of oppression, is really important. And I think another important part is to make sure that you take care of yourself, because addressing rape and sexual violence is heavy. It can be really difficult work, and I think just the key to not burning out and being able to like keeping on with this work is to make sure that you take that space and take care of yourself. But yeah, just having those difficult conversations and even having like those difficult self-reflecting moments, and really look at like how you move through the world and how you treat people. And I think it's a call out, but a call in to do this work every day.
MaryJo, listening to the three of you, and obviously under the bold and brilliant leadership of Dr. Linder, gives me so much hope about this movement and about where we're going. I have been involved in the anti-sexual violence movement for 15 years, and I wish that I had had the sober-minded approach of making sure that my heart was okay, that my mind was okay, because I kept stepping into this work, and it was painful. So, Mary Jo, thank you for reminding us. We also matter. We deserve to make sure that we're okay, because if we're okay, then we can make sure other people are okay. So, thank you for that, Mary Jo. Dr. Linder, I did just want to revisit that question regarding active witness response. And so, as you mentioned, the Atlanta shooting, but then also the attack that happened in New York, we saw a very violent incident on video where an elderly Asian woman was attacked, and there were people who stood feet away from her. And now, as folks might think, well, what does that have to do with sexual violence? Again, going back to that root cause of power and violence being interconnected. Dr. Linder, how do we encourage and embolden communities to believe, in fact, that when they witness harm, they disrupt it, they interrupt it, and they do something to address it? What can we say to our community?
Gosh, I don't know. That's so hard. What does come up for me though is exactly what you just said, Nubia, is that I am hopeful in watching people who are much younger than me be much braver than I ever have been when it comes to physical kinds of interactions. So I think, like, I am hopeful listening to students talk about ways to intervene that don't involve calling the police, and ways to be part of a community and address things from within their circle of influence, and just acknowledging yet again that we all make up these communities, and so when we change our communities. So I think those are big parts of it. I also think creating opportunities, the shame piece is so big, not only for people who have caused harm around sexuality or sexual relationships, but also, like, I think about myself as a white person and the ways that I have stepped in it and hurt people of color when trying to engage in racial justice work, right? And so I think we do have a culture that can sometimes make it so that people won't embrace their fragility around our dominant identities and really jump in and engage. So I think figuring out ways to create those communities where people can be vulnerable, be honest, talk about the times they've messed up, and then talk about the times that they take responsibility for it, that helps us be in community with people who are different from us, which then makes us feel like when we see an elderly Asian woman being built up, she is part of my community. That's not somebody else that's not part of me, or I'm not connected to them. But when we've created communities in which we understand how we're all connected to each other, our vulnerabilities are different, yet we all have them. And so I think for me, those are some of the ways I think about how we empower people to see all of us as humans, and all of us as worthy of being safe and protected. I think that's one of the pieces of research that exists about bystander intervention indicates very blatantly that white women are way less likely to intervene when the potential victim of a sexual assault is a Black woman. That is scary to me. The fact that educated white women do not see themselves as connected to Black women is a huge problem. And so whatever we can do to make it so that we see ourselves as in community with each other, and we understand how our humanity is locked up together, that's when I think we'll see people feeling like they need to and can intervene in situations like that.
Deeply powerful, and I did not mean to give you such a loaded question that would take an entire semester to unpack, but that was a great response, Dr. Linder, especially because, again, what you highlighted was that we consistently have to do introspection and making sure that we're reflecting, where's my power, what's my privilege, how do I use it? So thank you for modeling that for us, and also reminding us that we're seeking to create the beloved community. We're seeking to create and the type of community where we see our humanity interconnected. So thank you so much. Taylor, Blessing, or MaryJo, you unmuted. Go ahead.
Yeah. This analogy might seem a little childish, but I really love it, especially in situations like this. I think when we're looking at these big problems and they feel like societal and just institutional, systemic, just like really big, it's hard to feel like you yourself as an individual can do anything. But then whenever you see a movie about time travel, that one person changes the course of history. So I think it doesn't matter if it feels like what you're trying to fight against and is massive. I think the individual is incredibly powerful. And I think that's something that we forget about when we're looking at widespread historical issues.
Thank you, MaryJo. I think once again, you've affirmed, the power of influence that each of us carry, and how oftentimes the narrative that somehow, but I'm just one person. How could I do anything? And yet you can do so much, right? So thank you once again, MaryJo, for seeding that into our audience, reminding folks to do the heavy lift, to get involved. Excellent. So with the 10 minutes that we have left, I want to be really mindful. And just again, especially for our students, Taylor, Blessing, and MaryJo, tell me the one thing that you have loved about working at the center, which might seem a little bit strange to say love with a center that addresses this. And yet there's a lot of power I'm witnessing on this panel. So have you grown emotionally? Have you grown academically? Has it shifted your own perspective? How have you, what do you love?
I really have loved all the opportunities to learn and to challenge my own beliefs, and just it's given me an opportunity to reframe some of my experiences that brought me to this work, and understand them in a different light. It's been very powerful. It's been very powerful. It's also been very empowering as well. I worked on a crisis line a little bit ago, and it was really important and it was really great work. But to also come to go to this work at the primary prevention angle has been very empowering.
Thank you, MaryJo. How about you, Taylor?
I think for me, I do not think it's inappropriate at all to use the word love, because I love the work that I'm doing. And even though it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with my major, like this is definitely a passion for me. Personally, I am not a survivor of sexual assault, but I am a victim of domestic violence. And so being able to enter these spheres where I have felt the impact and the damage of what we're talking about, and not only have that personal perspective, but also know that I am actively working to end it, just really lights a fire underneath me. I feel like I'm actually solving the problems I struggled with when I was younger, right? And I just think it's so interesting, because I also do some work at the YWCA domestic violence shelter in Utah. And it's just so interesting going back and forth, because when I'm at the YWCA and these people are telling me just, everything that's happened, and their question is why is it happening to me? I can come back to my other job and actually look at why it is happening. It's a lack of empathy. It's entitlement. It is power. It has nothing to do with who the victim is. It has nothing to do with, or it does have stuff to do with who the victim is, but I mean, the victim does not play any part in enticing violence at all. And I get to come back to them and wholeheartedly tell them there's no part of it that is your fault. And so I absolutely love everything that I've been learning here.
Thank you so much, Taylor. And I do just want to affirm, Again, when we have an opportunity to sit in the spaces of the darkest moments with the survivors and to offer comfort, it is a privilege. It is a gift. So thank you for what you're all doing. Blessing, how about you?
Yeah, I feel like I'm going to echo a lot of what's already been said, but if I had to sum it up in one word, probably the education. Kind of going back to what I was talking about, like I learned that I was doing inappropriate behaviors, and I also came to this realization that things I had experienced wasn't okay. And it sounds weird, but like I had experienced things that I thought were weird, but like not out of the ordinary. But then the more I learned, I was like, oh, that wasn't okay. And the shelf kind of broke where I was like, oh, this really has impacted me. And I didn't really realize it until then. And then on top of that, it's just been really great to see how much the community wants to be involved. Like, I'll be honest, I wasn't very optimistic about people coming to like working groups or signing up for workshops and things just because, you know, we're a new center. We're just getting our feet on the ground, but it's been so empowering to see that the community wants to talk about this kind of stuff, even though it's really hard and it's really necessary. And I guess last, I just love learning. Like, if I could be in college forever, I would. But, and I've just learned so much here, like more than any other job, more than any other class. Like, I've definitely had the biggest personal growth and change through this job. So I just love it. Yeah, I love coming to work every single day. So.
Excellent, Blessing. I so appreciate your comments because more than anything, that's also a testament to the leadership and the culture and the workplace environment that Dr. Linder has cultivated. So I'm going to go ahead and just say, Dr. Linder, you should be proud because when they're talking about the joy that they find in those four walls that you have created, it really is because of the space that you're inviting them to explore, to be curious, to do some of that self-work, to ask the hard questions, and to invite community to do the lift. So Dr. Linder, how does that make you feel? What's your heart feeling right now?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for those kind words. And MaryJo she has class and she's doing a presentation at the beginning, so she had to step away. She shared earlier. I do have immense amounts of both pride and hopefulness. I too have been doing this work for a very long time. I started as a victim advocate at a domestic violence shelter in Columbia, Missouri, back in 2001 as a volunteer. And so this has been a long journey for me. I am a secondary survivor. I grew up in a home with a lot of violence until I was about 13 years old. And so this is it's very much part of my own healing. It's been really powerful for me to have had that experience as a direct provider for survivors, so working directly with survivors for 10 years. And then I did need to take a big old break from it for a while because I needed to do my own healing from the secondary trauma that I was carrying from listening to those stories over and over again for so long and feeling like there's not something, what these survivors are asking for doesn't yet exist. And now being in a position where I can help create and bring people together who have these amazing ideas and like get us moving together on a path together to create that thing that doesn't yet exist, but that many survivors have been begging for a very long time. And what I mean by that is this transformative and restorative approach to healing for all of us, because we know that most people who have caused harm experienced harm first, and that it's just a cycle that keeps perpetuating. And so we know that part of ending violence is creating space for all people to heal and be whole human beings. And that's a strategy for stopping violence from happening in the first place. And so I just feel very proud to get to be part of this movement and grateful for all the people who have said, yes, we want to join you on this journey. Messy as it is, let's keep moving forward and seeing what we can create together.
Excellent, Dr. Linder. And speaking of people wanting to support the work, is there a way for people to either donate or to collaborate? Like, how do we support this center? How do we make sure that this work continues to be done at the U?
Yeah, so a lot of ways. So the primary way is to go to our website. Our website was built by Blessing, so she gets a lot of kudos for that. So if you go to our website, the website is violenceprevention.utah.edu. And when you go to that, if you scroll down to the bottom, there are two links there. One says donate and one says contact us. So you can donate right there through the center's website. You're also welcome to sign up for our newsletter that goes out periodically. That's how you can keep abreast of what's going on. The list of working groups is also there, so you can email us if you're interested in getting involved with one of those working groups. And then on our education page on the violence prevention website, there's a form that you can fill out to request a presentation or an educational workshop for your student organization. We've done presentations all over the place. So we're happy to go on campus, off campus, students, non-students, all the people, whoever wants to engage in a conversation around these topics, we're happy to try and facilitate those.
That is wonderful, Dr. Linder. Thank you so much for being so accessible to our community. And again, to Taylor, Blessing, and MaryJo for sharing space on this panel. It was wonderful getting to know you. And so since we have reached the end of our time, I just once again want to say it was a pleasure hearing from you about the center's mission and work. I want to thank you for your leadership and service to our U of U community. So to our audience, thank you so very much for joining us. And we do hope that you have left inspired to get involved in disrupting and eliminating rape and sexual violence in our community. Lastly, thank you to the U alumni for hosting the 2021 U to U lecture series. We hope that you are safe and well and that you will join us for the next lecture. Have a great day, all. Bye.